Naomi Haupt is an anthropologist and researcher affiliated with the University of the Free State in South Africa. She has recently highlighted the issue of child soldiers in Africa in a report for the Institute for Security Studies African Futures. Well, one of the figures she mentions in her report is that 21,000 children have been recruited by regional armed forces over the past 5 years as soldiers. Well, Naomi is joining us in the National Security News studios to discuss this. Hi, Naomi, and thanks for being here.
I really appreciate it.
Well, how pervasive is this problem, and where in Africa is it specifically an issue?
The countries that are mostly affected through child soldiering are West and Central and East Africa, including countries such as the Central African Republic, the DRC, South Sudan, Somalia, Mali, Sudan, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, and even closer home in Southern Africa, in northern Mozambique, an armed group linked to the Islamic State has reported used boys as young as 13-year-olds in violent raids and looting missions.
So what are the main driving forces, behind children joining an army?
I think foremost would be armed conflict, wars, insurgencies, ongoing conflicts, political instability, poverty, ethnic tensions, weak governance, competition over natural resources, as well as displacement are a few of the reasons that child soldiers are used. And children in these areas are especially vulnerable, unfortunately, as they are often targeted by armed groups. Many of these children come from impoverished backgrounds, and joining an armed group will mean there's access to food, shelter, and even a sense of belonging. Poverty is also a huge driving factor, as the World Bank reports that 40% of sub-Saharan Africa's population lives in extreme poverty, which directly will contribute to this vulnerability in recruitment. I think one of the other reasons is weak governance, due to poor governance, lawlessness, corruption, a lack of state control, and military groups exploiting children for their own benefit. A 2021 Human Rights Watch report documented how the absence of state authority in countries like South Sudan exacerbates forced recruitment. There's also cultural or ideological reasons such as religion or ethnicity, where militant groups will target children as part of the indoctrination, viewing them as easy to manipulate, supporting their cause. And I think it's a complexity of conflicts, as many African countries are characterized by a mix of state and non-state actors, including insurgent groups, militias, and foreign interventions. This complexity makes state resolution and peace-building efforts particularly challenging.
So in how many countries are there conflicts or wars at the moment?
The current active conflicts in Africa, Burkina Faso are facing insurgencies from groups like the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, and Al-Qaeda initiatives. There's Cameroon that's dealing with the Boko Haram insurgency, the Central African Republic, engaged with various conflicts with various armed groups vying for control. There's the DRC experiencing multiple conflicts, including the M23 rebellion and other militia activities. Ethiopia, the Tigray conflict, which began late in 2020, has drawn in neighboring countries, further complicating the regional security landscape. Mali is facing insurgencies from groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. And ISGS, Mozambique, is dealing with the Islamic State in Mozambique, ISM insurgency in Cabo Delgado. Niger experiencing attacks from ISGS and other extremist groups. Nigeria battling Boko Haram and its splinter group, the Islamic State, West Africa province. There's Somalia confronting the Al-Shabaab insurgency. South Sudan engaged in internal conflicts involving various factions. And then Sudan since April 2023. Sudan has been engulfed in war following a breakdown between the Sudanese army and the rapid support forces. And then the impact on displacement. Conflicts across Africa have displaced over 40 million people, with countries like Sudan, Somalia, the DRC, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Ethiopia being the most affected.
So what ages are these kids?
Some as young as 5, some as young as 8. 15, 12. According to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the 196 countries signed that, and 173 countries signed the optional protocol to protect children from armed conflict. And both of these prohibit the recruitment of children under 18 years of age, but it's unfortunately not enforced.
Well, I know in the past that in some of these conflicts, drugs have been involved. That these kids have been given drugs to overcome fear, to overcome inhibitions. Is this happening now?
That is happening now. A report that I read on Colombia last week, alcohol is also used in order to drug the children or to capture, kidnap them, to become part of the groups. So unfortunately, it is a incredible, heartbreaking problem, as there is forced drug abuse, but there is many more human rights abuses that accompany this.
So girls face unique challenges, or do girls also join these armies?
Yes, they do. 40% of child soldiers globally are girls. Obviously, they are exposed to sexual violence. Girls are often subjected to sexual violence, forced marriages, and sexual slavery by armed groups. There is a double stigma that are faced by child soldiers, as girls may also be ostracized for sexual exploitation and pregnancy resulting from this violence, and also cultural exclusion if she is pregnant and unmarried in a specific culture. Girls will often get limited support through reintegration programs, as most reintegration programs are focusing on boys. So gender-sensitive or gender-focused reintegration programs, there's a big need for that.
So why does child soldier recruitment persist specifically in Africa, despite all the conventions on the rights of children that you've read about earlier?
Weak enforcement laws. Despite the international conventions, like I mentioned, there's weak enforcement, there's political instability. There's also the persistence of recruitment. South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo failed to prosecute recruitment cases effectively, with less than 5% of the perpetrators facing legal consequences.
The regional frameworks like ECOWAS's child policy, or even the African Union, have they been addressing this issue?
Yes, they have. The ECOWAS Child Policy 2019 to 2030 aims to reduce the use of child soldiers through advocacy, legal frameworks, and capacity building. However, while it provides a strategic framework, it has limited success due to inconsistent implementation, especially in conflict zones where national governments are weak. There has been some success with this policy in Sierra Leone, with 2,000 child soldiers that were rehabilitated, where, in high conflict zones, implementation is more difficult. Some regional collaborations have led to the reduction in child soldier recruitment in countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia, but these efforts are not universally effective across the region, and that is also due to some of the successes of the DDR programs, the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration programs.
Can international legal mechanisms, such as the International Criminal Court, can that play a role?
Under Article 8 of the Rome Statute, the ICC did convict Thomas Lubanga from the DRC for recruiting child soldiers, setting a significant legal precedent. He was found guilty of enlisting and conscripting children under the age of 50 and using them actively to participate in hostilities. Then there's also Charles Taylor of Liberia and Joseph Kony from Uganda that have also been found guilty of using child soldiers. But the problem is the effectiveness of the ICC is limited by challenges in arresting the perpetrators and the reluctance of some African countries to cooperate.
Have there been some successes, in programs such as the DDR programs? Have there been successes in reintegrating children, in preventing this?
Yes. Liberia, through their disarmament, demobilization, reintegration program, have demobilized over 3,000 children, according to a UN peacekeeping report. while South Sudan's DDR coverage only reached 30% due to funding gaps. Funding constraints have significantly limited the reach of and the success of DDR programs in South Sudan. Yes, challenges would be financial constraints, limited access to remote areas, and social stigmatization often impede successful reintegration. In some cases, former child soldiers are often re-recruited by other armed groups.
So, and is it difficult for these kids to be reintegrated into their communities?
Yes, it is because there is normally a stigma attached to them for boys and girls as well. So community-based reintegration would be vital to help with the reintegration process. It will help reduce the stigma and support sustainable recovery. It will help with preventing re-recruitment. It's important to have programs that offer counseling, vocational skills, and education. UNICEF noted that there is a 25% reduction in recruitment through community-based programs in Uganda. So Uganda had a bit of success, and it's also important to do a lot of work in the communities and to ensure the buy-in from the communities in order to support the children. They're already traumatized. They had to see and do incredibly traumatic things. They have lost their innocence, and if they come back to the community and are shunned by the community, what hope is there left for them?
So there's a stigma attached to it.
Yeah, there's a stigma attached to the child soldiers. Some of them worked as porters, as soldiers, as slaves, as sex slaves as well. And especially with some of the younger girls that have had pregnancies, then brings an unwanted child back into the community. That is where the stigma comes from.
You've mentioned funding as a challenge for DDR initiatives. So what strategies can ensure sustainable financial support for these programs?
I would say that countries, especially African countries, should have a special budget for DDR programs. I think that they should see the need. These children are the future of Africa. Countries and international organizations can create long-term funding agreements for DDR programs by partnering with NGOs, private sector, and local communities. There has to be accountability. There has to be increased government commitments. National governments must allocate sufficient resources and prioritize child soldier reintegration within their development strategies. There should be diversified funding sources, alternative sources such as crowdfunding or multinational aid funds. For example, the Ivory Coast Trust Fund raised $10 million annually, but the Sahel initiative faces erratic finances, which then affects the sustainability and the effectiveness of these programs.
And UNICEF, what role has UNICEF played?
Over 7,000 children have been rehabilitated by UNICEF in the Central African Republic and South Sudan. However, there are persistent gaps remaining in addressing children's needs or girls' needs. UNICEF has been actively involved in the rehabilitation of child soldiers in these regions. However, numbers may vary. UNICEF supports the children through reintegration, education, psychosocial counseling, and family reunification programs. And as I mentioned, there is insufficient focus on gender-sensitive programs for girls, and monitoring systems for former child soldiers are often inadequate.
Okay, so what steps do you think African governments can take to strengthen child protection systems, and are they taking it?
Yes, there is actually good news, if one can call it like that. Uganda invested 30% in education, and that reduced the recruitment of children by 30%, as seen in the Uganda conflict. Investments in education have been shown to significantly reduce the vulnerability of children to recruitment by armed groups. There should be stronger legal frameworks, enforcing stricter laws against child soldier recruitments, and to improve the cooperation with international bodies like the UN. There should be community-based protection, ensuring local authorities and families are trained to identify and prevent recruitment. And then education and vocational skills should be taught to at-risk children to reduce their vulnerability to recruitment.
Is it difficult to track what is really going on? Is it a reflection of what's really happening on the ground?
I would say yes or no. I don't think all the child soldiers are listed or noted or being tracked. As many children are kidnapped or they just disappear. So I think from that point of view, it would be difficult to many African countries tracking their DDR programs through monitoring and evaluation. I don't think all the statistics come in regularly to enable an accurate view. However, satellite tracking, according to the UNICEF Tech Report, satellite tracking and GIS are now mapping recruitment hotspots in real time for faster intervention. And UNICEF has now started incorporating geospatial data and satellite imagery to enhance data collection and intervention strategies. And I think NGOs can only be as successful as the African governments would be able to support them with correct statistics and data on what is on child soldiers and what is actually happening.
So is it the rise of Islamist insurgencies that are driving these trends for child soldier recruitment?
Yes. It seems that is in some of the other maps that I've seen, especially Athlete, where they show where Islam or Islamic insurgencies are busy moving south. And it's quite worrying to see that what are the African nations doing in protecting and keeping their people safe. But as I referred to earlier, I think the natural resources plays a big role in some of these insurgencies, as well as external groups coming in. It is quite worrisome that Islamic insurgencies and jihadism is starting to become problematic in Africa, and they seem to be gaining ground.
So do you think that will make the situation worse for children?
Yes, they do, because children are recruited. Children are used as human shields. They are seen as cannon fodder. They are seen as replaceable. Some children have even been used in wearing suicide vests. It is a dire situation. I think that what is worrying some for me is it is happening, but it does not always make the front page news. Yes, there is global problems all over, and everybody needs help and assistance. But these children are the future of the world. They are our future leaders. What will happen to them if there is no voice for them standing up? Yes, there are NGOs and organizations doing an incredible work that is trying to make a difference. I would like to see more done. And hopefully, my next steps would be to pursue a PhD, and I would like to focus on child soldiers and to be a voice, and especially on the effect thereof on girls. I believe that they do not have a voice at all.
Is there a figure in your head that that you would need to really address this problem and hit it on the head?
Yes, it's estimated that $1.37 billion will be required by 2026 to meet the protection needs of children in armed conflict.
That's a big number.
I also believe that child soldiers that have gone through the DDR programs should also be involved in policies, in that they can be a voice and enable the protection of those that are still stuck and that are still literally fighting for their lives.
You don't want to use aid as a weapon against countries, but do you think in this case it might actually be useful to tell countries that you can't get aid unless you address this issue?
Yes, that is what I believe. Maybe that is one of the One of the ways that one can strengthen accountability in Africa, the African Union is there, ECOWAS is there. Maybe there should be more cross-border and SADC, yes. There should be more cross-border collaboration between them where they can stand up against the insurgencies, against the rebel groups, against the militias, against the jihadists, and take a stand for what Africa believes in. Africa is very rich in natural minerals. Why should we become a war zone for rebel groups? Africa can be successful. Yeah, it's called accountability. There has to be the political will, and as I mentioned earlier, there has to be the intentionality also. So I absolutely believe that any foreign financial donors to any country that makes themselves guilty of employing or recruiting child soldiers should not receive the aid until they can show that they can let the children go, that they are willing to come to an agreement.
Because these kids, I mean, their lives are ruined, and it's so difficult to integrate back in society and to be respected as human beings after this, even though they are the victims.
Absolutely, and I don't think it's possible to quantify the economic impact on a country if a child had not been a child soldier and were able to go to school and were able to learn a trade and contribute to the economy of the country. How different would Africa have looked if there were no child soldiers? How different would Africa have looked economically?
So, Naomi, how did you become passionate about this subject? What prompted you?
I did my master's on the park rangers, the field rangers, and the anti-poaching rangers in the context of that protects rhino poaching. I've got a master's degree in anthropology, and I wrote ethnography on park rangers, and it was very interesting to see how they're shaped through culture, how they're shaped through traditions and beliefs. And initially, I was thinking of doing my PhD on jihadism and conservation and biodiversity and terrorism. And then I wrote an article that's not yet been published on the history of the AK-47 in Africa and all the statistics. That is absolutely frightening. And then one thing just kind of led to the other, and that is why it's also called child soldiers. It was the ease of use of the AK-47. It's easy to use that even children can use that. And then I just started digging around, and then the article on child soldiers just happened. So, and as I mentioned earlier, you have to have a voice. One has to speak up on something that you're passionate about. If you don't do it, somebody else will.
Naomi Haupt, thank you so much for speaking to us. That was so interesting.
Linda, thank you for the opportunity and for having a heart for the child soldiers in Africa, and hopefully we can make a difference in one child's life. Thank you very much.